The Boston Celtics are in their second NBA Finals in the last 3 years. Was it the easiest path ever potentially to get to the finals? Probably. But still, they're a very good team. 20 losses on the season between the regular and the postseason going into the NBA Finals is not an easy thing to do. And so I think it's important to think about how exactly the Celtics got here. How did they put together a roster that was capable of obviously winning the title this season? It's especially interesting because the roster looks pretty different from the group that they brought to the finals in 2022, not to mention, of course, the coaching situation is different. But let's begin with the things that aren't different. We have, of course, Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown. This is the foundation of this era of Celtics basketball, whether it was the Kyrie teams, they brought in Gordon Hayward, they've had all these different versions of the team, but since they've brought these two guys in, they've been the foundation. Now, Tatum was picked back in 2017, and of course, this was an interesting situation for him because he actually went third overall to Philadelphia, but of course, before the draft, the picks switched back and forth. Boston ended up at 3. They traded back from 1. That was the Markelle Fultz pick. Philly moved up to 1 to select Fultz, and the only reason Philadelphia had that pick in the first place is because of a deal that they did with the Kings earlier on, which granted them a pick swap in the 2017 draft, and so they swapped from 5 up to 3, and Sacramento ended up with the 5th pick in that draft. The rest of the details for the trade are that the Celtics also got an extra first-round pick to move back from 1 to 3 to select Tatum. That extra first-round pick ends up becoming Romeo Langford. So ultimately, it's basically Tatum for Fultz, and of course, Tatum has been arguably the best player in the entire draft class and arguably a top 10 player in the league right now. Now for Jaylen Brown, he was also selected 3rd overall, but this time in the 2016 draft. And of course, the Celtics had that draft pick as a result of the crazy trade that they made with the Nets that involved Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, that is somehow over a decade old at this point. My Brooklyn Nets traded all those draft picks away, and some of them ended up becoming really valuable, including the 3rd overall pick in 2016, which becomes Jaylen Brown. But the rest of the pieces on the roster were all just built around that, and it's really interesting how they were able to get them. And one of the most consequential was a piece that didn't really seem like a huge deal at the time, and that's Derrick White. They traded for him at the 2022 trade deadline. That's the year that Boston made the finals under Ime Udoka, and at that point, at the trade deadline, the Celtics had started to figure some things out. They were really guarding well, they were scoring well, and they didn't start the year particularly well, but they really started to figure things out, and as I said, end up finishing the year extremely well, end up making the finals. And they needed a little bit more help in the backcourt. They needed another guard they could put out there. They really didn't have a ton of great guard depth, and so they go out and get Derrick White from the Spurs. And what it cost them was essentially some salaries, Romeo Langford, and then their first-round pick that season, as well as a future pick swap in 2028. And that 2022 first ends up becoming Blake Wesley. Not a huge deal for San Antonio right now. We'll see what the pick swap ends up becoming. But I remember at the time I made a video and I was like, Derrick White's good. I'm just a little bit confused about the draft compensation exchanged here. Like Derrick White being worth 1.5 first-round picks at the time seemed like an overpay for me. And I understood what Boston wanted to do, but I was concerned about what the roster was going to look like moving forward, because at the time they started to play better, but they certainly weren't, a title contending team at that point. That happened after they traded for White and they started to really play well. They were playing well up to the trade, but it wasn't, they'd struggled so much at the beginning of the year relative to expectations that it wasn't some kind of crazy leap that made me think that the White trade was going to be the piece that put them over the top. And it didn't necessarily put them over the top, although obviously they came within 2 games of winning the title in 2022 before falling to the Warriors. But it was at least a piece that set them on a path to build the team that they have now. And White has been, at times, even with this current group, the 3rd best player on the team. He's great defensively, leads guards and blocks, shoots really well, can create for them as well, and is just this awesome in-between piece that a lot of contenders would love to have. But then we get to a couple of the big ones, right? Kristaps Porzingis and Jrue Holiday are linked in a couple of different ways here for Boston. Of course, they're brought in the same offseason in 2023, but some of the pieces involved are actually linked as well. I'm going to begin with Porzingis, and then we'll get to Jrue. So initially, Boston had a deal in place to get Kristaps Porzingis from Washington, but initially the 3rd team in that deal was actually the Clippers. The Clippers were going to send a first-round pick to Washington. KP was going to go to Boston, and Malcolm Brogdon was going to end up on the Clippers. And for Washington at the time, that was fine by them because they weren't going to keep KP. He needed a new contract. It was a sign and trade situation. They sent him to Boston. The Clippers felt like they needed another guard. They had a pick to spare. It might have been actually the first pick in the 2nd round. Essentially, it was draft compensation that the Clippers were giving up. And they were like, okay, Malcolm Brogdon's good. The problem was they got concerned with Brogdon's medicals later on in the process. And this was a reported trade. It was tweeted out and everything. And then it was actually rescinded. Keep that in mind when we get to the Jrue Holiday part, because Malcolm Brogdon is going to become important here in a second. But what ends up happening, the trade that actually goes through, is the 3rd team of the deal, the Clippers, get replaced by Memphis. They end up with Marcus Smart. That's who Boston sends out. Boston ends up getting KP, and Washington gets some extra stuff as well. And so they still end up with Porzingis, but they had to get rid of Marcus Smart in order to do it, although they did get some extra compensation. Which then brings us to the Jrue Holiday trade, because at the time of the first Porzingis trade, Jrue Holiday was not available, or at least not on the level that he would be after the Dame trade, right? Like, Milwaukee trades away Jrue Holiday for Damian Lillard after the first KP trade, and pieces of that deal end up in the Jrue Holiday trade from Portland. So we know the story there, right? Like, Dame ends up going to Milwaukee. Jrue Holiday ends up in Portland. It's clear they want to trade him. It's clear that he has value. He was arguably the centerpiece of the deal. They felt like they could get extra value in the Dame trade by then, swapping out Jrue elsewhere. And so Boston ends up calling them up, and they say, hey, we've got the contracts of Malcolm Brogdon. We've got Robert Williams, who could be an interesting big for you. And we've got a first that we got in this Grizzlies trade. It's a 2024 first-round pick from the Warriors. Can we have Jrue Holiday? And so that's the deal that ends up going through. And so you have all these pieces swapping around, but essentially Boston ends up with Jrue Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis in exchange for Marcus Smart, Malcolm Brogdon, and Robert Williams. That's pretty wild that they were able to do that all in one offseason, I should say, and it completely transformed their roster. Like, the 2022 team was really good. Ime Udoka was a better coach than Joe Mazzulla is right now, and that team had their strengths. But this team is built in a way that you had the best 5-man unit in the entire league, and it's a lineup that makes sense. There's no confusion about who's going to start and who's going to come off the bench. And being able to get Holiday and Porzingis is essential to the Celtics' success this season. In terms of the other, kind of key players on the roster, another interesting player to keep an eye on here, of course, would be Al Horford. He initially signed with Boston in free agency in 2016. Had a couple of really good years there, of course, was a part of the Kyrie, Gordon, Hayward teams, and then ends up going to Philadelphia in 2019 via free agency. Remember, he was supposed to be like the quasi backup to Joel Embiid, also play alongside Joel Embiid. Philly spent a ton of money on him. That didn't work at all. A year later, he gets dumped to Oklahoma City as a salary dump and basically doesn't play for the Thunder. And then Boston comes back around and they're like, hey, we'll take the Al Horford contract. We know that he'll be good for us, and we have a contract of our own in Kemba Walker that we would like to dump. So they sent Kemba and a first to OKC to get Al Horford back on the team after he left the team in 2019 free agency. Now, to be fair to Boston, that first round pick did end up becoming Alperen Sengun. Now, OKC didn't end up with Sengun. They ended up with, I think that was Ousmane Dieng that they traded up for and then traded out of the Sengun spot. Sengun, of course, ending up in Houston. But it's interesting how Al was a guy that was really good for Boston. They lost him. They didn't want to pay him that much money. Then he still ends up back with them and has been awesome, especially with KP hurt for a good part of the playoffs. In terms of some other guys, like Peyton Pritchard was picked in the first round in 2020. Sam Hauser was a two-way player that they converted. But it's interesting to look at, things we can learn from how Boston put this team together, right? Like, they built the foundation. Jaylen Brown, Jayson Tatum, they had those two guys, and they knew that they had skilled size. They had wings that could guard and could score. And they just needed to build everything else out around that. So they brought in Derrick White. They had Marcus Smart. They had success with those teams. Robert Williams was really good defensively. And the final piece for them was another elite guard that they could swap in and out the responsibilities of being the main defender with Derrick White and Jrue Holiday. Those are two of the best guard defenders in the entire league, having more versatility there, as well as someone that they know can start at end games for them. There's no question what the best 5-man unit is. And then they needed more of an offensive punch in the front court. They needed someone that could punish switches, because as good as Brown and Tatum are, they're not fantastic in the post. They're not guys that are going to be great when teams are switching. And so a lot of times that's how teams would decide to guard Boston, because of all their 3-point shooting. But you can't switch on Kristaps Porzingis. The year before in Washington, when Boston traded for him, his post-up efficiency skyrocketed from his previous levels, really worked on his post-up game. And Boston saw that, and they said, this is the perfect guy that can space, that can guard, and can punish mismatches. And he's been one of the best post-up players in the entire league by the advanced numbers this season. Has been a perfect fit in Boston. So the things we can learn from them is, one, they absolutely nailed the trades, obviously, to trade back for Tatum and get the picks from Brooklyn to get Jaylen Brown. But every piece since then has been, how do we complement these two guys? These are our foundation. How do we find value where other teams aren't? They took the injury risk on KP. They took the risk on Jrue Holiday's offensive performance kind of falling off of the prior few seasons. They took the risk on Derrick White, someone that wasn't seen as overwhelmingly valuable at the time, and I thought it was a little bit of an overpay at the time. And they just all fit perfectly together. And then, of course, the bench they put together as well. And it's created this team that, in certain ways, has dominated this NBA season. Remains to be seen if that'll be the case in the finals, but that's how Boston was able to put this team together.